welcome to the deep dive. We're going to be diving into something pretty fascinating. We're going to be talking about risk acceptance. And, we encounter risk every day, from choosing between investments to deciding, hey, should I try that new spicy food truck? But when it comes to the big thing, the massive projects in industries, or decisions that affect entire society, well, how do we actually decide what level of risk is acceptable? So let's imagine, just for a second, that you're in charge of a huge construction project, like a massive bridge or a skyscraper. So it's pretty exciting, right? But it's also incredibly risky. You've got worker safety to worry about, environmental concerns. You've got to worry about potential delays and cost overruns. So how do you find that balance between making progress and keeping things safe? And how do you decide when a risk is just too big to even consider taking? So one of the most common approaches that's used is something called ARAER, as low as reasonably practicable. So think of it this way. You want to make that project as safe as you possibly can, but you also have to be realistic, right? You can't eliminate every single risk. And some safety measures are going to be crazy expensive or even just impossible to implement. So ALARP is all about finding kind of that sweet spot, right? Where you're reducing the risks down to the lowest level that makes sense technically and economically. So for example, you might decide to go with extra strong steel for that bridge, even if it costs a bit more. And that reduces the risk of it collapsing, which is obviously a huge concern. But you probably wouldn't build a giant net around the entire construction site to catch any falling objects. It's technically possible, but the cost would be astronomical, and that extra bit of safety that it adds might not be worth it. So see how that works. You're weighing those costs and benefits, and you're making those decisions based on the specifics of the situation. But now you might be thinking, okay, ALARP sounds good in theory, but how do we actually figure out what is reasonably practicable in the real world? And, well, that's where things get even more interesting, because it involves looking at things like, how likely is that risk to actually happen? A tiny chance of a small problem is probably acceptable, but a high chance of something catastrophic happening, yeah, not so much. And then what are the potential consequences? So, a small fire that's easily contained, no big deal. But a massive explosion that could harm people or the environment. And then what safety measures are even available and how effective are they? Sometimes a really simple fix can dramatically reduce risk, but other times even the best technology in the world can only do so much. So you have to take all these things into account to kind of start to get a clearer picture of what level of risk you're okay with accepting. But it's not just about numbers and probabilities. No, there's also a human side to risk acceptance. We have to think about, how do people perceive risk? What are their values? What are their priorities? For example, let's say you're deciding about building a new factory in a community. So on paper, the risks of that project might seem totally manageable. But what if the people who live there are completely against it because they're worried about things like pollution or noise? Where you can't just ignore those concerns, even if you think they're overreacting. You have to really work to build trust with them, engage with them, and try to address their fears. And sometimes, even if you've done absolutely everything right in terms of your risk assessment, you still might run into people who are opposed to your project. Because, risk is often perceived differently by different people. Some people are just naturally more cautious. They're risk averse. They'll always err on the side of caution. But other people are much more comfortable with uncertainty. They're willing to take bigger chances. And there's no right or wrong answer here. It's just human nature. But here's the real key takeaway. Risk acceptance. It's not just some cold and calculated process. It's about finding a balance between the science and what people value, between logic and emotion. It's about coming up with decisions that are technically sound, socially responsible at the same time. So the next time you hear about a big project or a decision that seems controversial, remember what we've talked about today. Ask yourself, what are the potential risks here? How are those risks being assessed? And maybe the most important, what level of risk are people okay with? By having these conversations, we can all help make better decisions about the risks we take on, both as individuals and as a society. Now, you might be wondering about some of those other risk assessment principles that are out there. We've only just scratched the surface here, so stay tuned, because we're going to delve even deeper into this in the next part of our deep dive.